Hi, my name is Eric Lowe with Swordwind, the Charlotte branch of the New York Historical Fencing Association, and in this series of videos we're going to be talking about foundational longsword cutting mechanics. In today's video we talk about grip, or what your hands do when you are cutting with a longsword. The first question when preparing to cut with a longsword is, are you wearing any sort of finger jewelry? If you are, take it off. Finger jewelry, like rings or ring cuffs, will get in the way of the proper action of your fingers on the handle of your sword. Second thing to notice is that your handle is oblong. With a sword or any kind of sword simulator, be it a waster, a fetish ferret, or even kitchen utensils that you're using to simulate a sword, the handle must have a wide edge and a narrow edge. Then I want you to look at your palm and notice that you have a pad of meat on both sides of your palm and a valley in between. This spot is critical for proper edge alignment and for proper power generation when cutting with a longsword. I want you to take the narrow edge of your sword and place it right in that spot between the two pads of meat, and then curl your fingers around the sword. Now you'll notice here I have the narrow edge of my pommel actually in contact with that spot between those two pads of meat. This is close, but it is not good enough. Similarly over here, close, no cigar. You must have actual contact right here with the narrow edge of your pommel. Now you'll notice that I've kind of curled my fingers around. I am not holding the sword like this, like a hammer. Swords, as you know, are balanced about here. They make terrible hammers. If you are in the Middle Ages and you want to hit something with a hammer, they make very fancy maces and war hammers for exactly that sort of thing. So how do I know, besides this point of contact, that I have my grip correct? There are a couple of mnemonics that you can use for this. One, if you open your hands, the fingers should project past the crossguard at an angle to the handle. Right? If I take the sword away for a moment, I am looking for this angle, not this angle. The second involves the bottom hand. Here with my bottom hand, I'm doing exactly the same thing as I was with my top. You'll see that I have actual contact right here at the base of my palm at the narrow edge of the handle. And now I have placed my top hand on top. I'm going to come around the camera so that you can see this. You'll notice that my hands fit together like a puzzle piece. The top knuckle on my bottom hand must not dig into my the wrist of my top hand. If I do that, I need to rotate this bottom hand in until they fit together just like this. Another way you can think about this is that the top part of the top side of your bottom hand should fit right in here along your wrist, your top wrist. Finally, the last mnemonic you can use is that you want your wrists actually behind the edge of the sword. Now, there are not many people who would deliberately cut like this. You can try that and it feels like a very good way to break your wrists. But there are a lot of people, myself included, who have a tendency to cut like this or like this. Hands are not very much rotated away. In fact, I still feel contact here at the base of my palms, but my wrists, as you can see, are now outside the edge. And when I come down, the sword is going to want to pop up between my wrists and in very extreme cases actually break them. More importantly, the skeletal structure of my arm will not then be supporting the cut as it passes down. Those are a couple of mnemonics you can use to make sure that your grip is correct. If this is wrong, it will show up in your test cutting, a lot of especially beginner problems with cutting show up as grip issues. Second question, where do your hands go on the handle? This handle is my preferred length for ungloved hands. It's about 8 inches long, or about 20.5 centimeters. With a handle that is this long, I prefer to place my top hand so that I have about 1.5 inches of handle showing on the thumb side. Over here, you'll see I'm not trying to jam my hand up against the crossguard. That exposes my knuckles unnecessarily, and it makes a proper grip difficult. Then I'm going to place my bottom hand as so that it is gripping whatever is left of the handle. If you have a very short handle, like an Albion Cressy or something of that sort, then you should place your bottom hand comfortably and jam your top hand as close as necessary. If you have a very long handle, this is a Purple Heart Armory Type 3 Penty synthetic, and it's got a 10 inch or about 25 centimeter handle. Then you have some options. You could do this, you could do this, you could choke back all the way down here, you could be up here. And again, my personal preference is to have 1 inch or so between my top hand and the crossguard. That's purely for safety reasons, so that if a sword impacts the crossguard, it is less likely to bite into my hand. But the question then arises, where does the bottom hand go? There should not be a lot of space between your two hands wherever you place them on the handle. Now, that doesn't mean that you should be actively jamming them together unless your hilt compels it, but it does mean that this, with a lot of space between the hands, is not optimal for cutting. The reason for that, as we'll get into later this video and in subsequent videos, is that longswords do not cut very well with a push-pull of the handle. I'm not pushing this hand, my top hand, forward and cranking back with my bottom hand. Both hands are doing basically the same thing for a maximally effective cut. Now, that's not to say that you can't throw a good cut with both hands, with your hands separated. But if you keep them together, especially if you were just learning, there is much less temptation to try and do this sort of thing. So now we have our hands placed on the handle. We have each hand at a proper grip. Next question, how hard should you be squeezing, or how tightly do you hold the sword? A lot of people use the analogy of cupping a bird or an egg. You want to hold the sword firmly enough that it's not going to escape you, but not so tightly that you're going to crush the baby bird or splatter the egg all over your hands. If that analogy works for you, then great. My personal preference is to get up in Vomtag and then let your sword be held tightly enough that it doesn't fall out of your hands, but not so tightly that gravity doesn't want to pull it out of your hands, right? I'm going to loosen my grip a little bit so you can see this motion on camera. Gravity should want to pull your sword down towards the ground, and you should let it a very small amount. I'm going to be gripping the sword mostly with my top two fingers on each hand. I'm not gripping just with the top hand and letting my bottom fingers be loose. Similarly, I am not gripping just with the bottom hand and letting my top fingers be loose. The top two fingers on each hand grip the sword ever so slightly more than the bottom fingers do. The reason for that is because I need to be able to squeeze these bottom two fingers like a trigger and make my sword do this. If I step away a little bit so that you can see that tip motion better, you should be able to get a fairly dramatic movement of the tip with just this finger squeeze. Now, I want to point out before we go any further, this is a finger squeeze. It is not popping up with the wrist. The reason I don't want to do that is because when I cut, if my wrist is bent more than about here, to the point that I could imagine a ruler taped to the back of my forearm and it would extend out this way. If my wrist ever pronates to the point that it would not be touching that ruler, then I have made my wrist a failure point for the cut. And when my sword impacts a resistive target, I'm going to lose a lot of energy through these bent wrists. We'll get into more of that later. But for now, when practicing this finger squeeze, your wrist will move a little bit. As you can see, my wrist is not totally stable, but the motion comes from the fingers and the fact that there is a weight in my hand, not because I am actively trying to move this joint forward like that. So again, as soon as your sword is in the plane of its cut, this begins your cut. If I stand here in Vomtag and I'm going to throw an Oberhau or a Zornhau, then my sword is already in the plane of a cut. And the very first thing I do, even before my feet move, before my hips move, before my arms move, is squeeze these fingers, get that tip kicked forward. That's also true in other guards. If I'm in Nebenhut and I'm going to throw an Unterhau, finger squeeze, then the hips and the arms move. If I do that from the side, you should be able to see I can kick my tip forward with just the finger squeeze. It's true even in a Zwerhau. As soon as I get into the plane of that cut, I need to squeeze those fingers so that I am kicking my tip forward. It's true with a Krumpau. As soon as I get to about here, squeeze those fingers. I'm demonstrating all of this a little more broken up than usual. Of course, when you are trying to cut for real, everything needs to be fluid and connected. But when you are learning what the components are that need to be connected, it is totally fine to just stand there, squeeze your fingers. If you can't get a lot of movement here, then you need to work on your grip strength. An exercise that we like to do in class is loop a belt around the top of the sword, or have a partner stand behind you and pinch the sword. And your task then is to pull it out of their hands just with your finger squeeze. If you want an extra challenge, you can try it with just one hand, either top or bottom. In the next video, we'll look at what the arms do. The video after that, hips and maybe feet, or we might break that up into 2 separate videos. I hope this has been helpful. Quick review of things that we went over. Contact right at the base of the palm here and the narrow edge of the handle with both the top hand, here you can see, and with the bottom hand, here you can see. I want my wrists behind the edge of the sword, not slightly out to the side. I certainly don't want a knuckle digging into my wrist. I don't want my hands to be very far apart. I certainly don't want them on the handle, on the pommel rather. Then I want to grip my sword tightly enough that it doesn't fall out of my hands, but not so tight that I don't have this room to kick my tip up with this finger squeeze. That finger squeeze again is with the bottom 2 fingers of each hand, not just the bottom hand, not just the top. And I am using my middle and index finger on each hand to sort of form a fulcrum that those bottom fingers can rotate the handle around. Once again, my name is Eric Lowe. This is Swordwind, the Charlotte branch of the New York Historical Fencing Association. Thanks for watching. 2 things I forgot. 1, is another feedback device for telling you that you are gripping your sword correctly. And that is, you should have calluses at the base of these fingers. They don't need to be huge and super visible, but they should be there. That's true for both sets of hands, calluses right here at the base of your ring finger and your little finger. That tells you that you are contacting the sword correctly when you do this finger squeeze. If that is not building up over time, then your grip is probably wrong, or you are not cutting with a finger squeeze the way you should. Second point I wanted to mention sort of as an appendix is, why aren't we gripping the pommel? The textual answer for this, certainly in Kunsteffekten, what is often termed German longsword, is that the author of the Nuremberg House Book, manuscript 3227A, specifically tells you, do not grip the pommel when you are cutting. He says this because the sword is supposed to act like a pair of scales, and you have a nice big weighted pommel here, which is supposed to help rotate the sword in your hand, right? If I step back here so that you can see, my sword is pointed away from me. When I throw the cut, my sword is now pointed forward and down. So there has been some amount of rotation within my hands. We'll talk about this ways that can go wrong in the next video. But for that to happen, there needs to be a counterweight to the weight of the blade, and if I am holding my pommel, then it is not counterweighting anything. Now, this is not to say there are no times when it is appropriate to grip the pommel. There are plenty of times it is appropriate to grip the pommel, particularly if you are up in left ox or a similar position and you want to jam this point into somebody. By all means, plant your hand here and shove. When you are cutting, however, is not one of those times. You can approach this question archaeologically a couple of different ways. One is to note that weighted pommels in the global history of swords are fairly rare. As you probably know, swords throughout Europe have had pommels for a long time, but but early period swords pretty much just have a pommel cap to keep the blade in place and or to protect the peen of the tang. They don't have this big weighted thing at the bottom. So we should ask ourselves, when we are talking about swords of the late Middle Ages and later, why is there this big great thing here? Secondly, you can note that as far as we can tell anyway, pretty much nobody ever covered the pommel in some sort of grip material. You don't see it covered in wire wrap. You don't see it covered in leather. If you were supposed to be grabbing the pommel all the time, then one would assume that somebody would have covered this thing in something that would help you maintain your grip on it. Finally, we can note that there are some pommels that are actually spiked, which obviously would be uncomfortable to hold. And you can also note that whatever shape your pommel is, it is almost certainly not oblong like your handle is. So there is no way to grip the pommel and feel, is my edge aligned, right? Here, if I am maintaining this proper point of contact right here at the base of my palms, I can feel, even with my eyes closed, if my sword turns even a tiny bit. If I'm grabbing the pommel, that is not true. Lastly, I want to back up and show you what that finger squeeze looks like in an Unterhau, since that is an especially challenging scenario for your finger squeeze. If I stand way back here, hopefully you can see the blade of my sword this time, and when I stand here in Nebenhut, I can squeeze and my sword blade moves quite a bit. If I finish the cut with my hips and my arms, then you can see I don't hit the ground the way I do if I'm just practicing the finger squeeze. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next video.